It really started in 1998, a long time ago. I had been a medical reporter for a long time, writing for newspapers, some magazines, and I was doing a series for the Boston Globe. I had a completely conventional understanding of psychiatry. I actually had very little interest in psychiatry, but I did a series for the Boston Globe of abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings, and that was going to be it. And I had we've heard a lot about the disease model, medical model. That's what I understood to be true, okay? We're making great progress. We have drugs that fix chemical imbalances. And then I came upon a study done by the World Health Organization, which compared outcomes in 3 developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia, with outcomes in the US and 6 other rich countries. And each time they found that outcomes were much better in the developing countries. And they even concluded, one was 5 years in length and one was 2 years in length. The World Health Organization investigators concluding that, listen to this, living in a developed country is a strong predictor you won't have a good outcome. So I'm like, well, why won't you have a good outcome if you're living in a good country? Because if this is a disease process and we have all these great drugs, why wouldn't we have good outcomes? And then I really looked at the study. And if you look at the studies, the 2 studies, it goes like this. After the first such study, which was 5 years in length, and they found much better social outcomes and functional outcomes in India and Nigeria, I said, maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries or developing countries, is that the patients are more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics. That was a hypothesis. It makes sense if the drugs are supposed to be so essential. I believe that. I thought you had to take antipsychotics. And then they measured medication use in the second study. And what did they find? They found that in India and Nigeria, people weren't, at that time, kept on the medications long term. They used them acutely, but not long term. So all of a sudden, here was a story, a scientific story, scientific finding, that outcomes were much better in these 2 countries that weren't using antipsychotics long term. And that opened up my senses. Is there something amiss with the scientific narrative that we're telling ourselves in the US and other developed countries? Because this completely belied that. And that was the start. So you have this narrative presented to us as a scientific narrative. And we believe that when a scientific narrative is presented to the public, that if then you go to the actual scientific reports, they'll be consistent. In other words, what is told to you will be found in the scientific literature. And what you find in psychiatry, and this is the sense of betrayal, and the sense of surprise, and the sense of disbelief, is they're out of sync. So for example, you will find in the scientific literature, well, the narrative is, we found that chemical imbalances cause these major disorders, and the drugs fix chemical imbalances like insulin for diabetes, right? That's a narrative of great scientific progress. And then you can ask a person, say, okay, just tell me where you found that a person with depression has low serotonin, or tell me where you found that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine. And you know what they'll tell you? Well, we didn't really find that. And I said, what do you mean you didn't really find it? And when I'm calling up people, they say, well, it's a metaphor to get people to take their drugs. And then, now you go to the scientific literature, you see it was a hypothesis born from understanding how the drugs acted on the brain, and then you find, in fact, that as early as the 1980s, researchers were saying, we're not finding that people with depression have low serotonin, or we're not finding that people with schizophrenia, as a matter of course, have overactive dopamine systems. So think about this. This is key to try to sort of this sense of disbelief. You have a story of scientific discovery that is being promoted around the world, and then when you go to see the scientific literature, you find that it fell apart. And it's hard to believe that sense of betrayal. It really is. And then what you find once you start down this path of investigating the scientific literature, that as early as 1970s, there were worries that antipsychotics were worsening the long-term course of schizophrenia, that they were increasing the risk that you'll be psychotic years later. Well, we're never told about that. And then next thing you know, if you look at the literature, you find that there's been this naturalistic long-term study of schizophrenia outcomes, and it was the people who came off their medication who were more likely to work, were more likely to be in recovery 5, 10, 15 years. And it's there, it's in the scientific literature, So as a newspaper person or as a reporter, journalist, you just got to report what's in their literature. And this was done by the National Institute of Mental Health, but it's not told to the public. So of course it's hard for the general public to believe this because they're having this whole profession organized around a scientific narrative, believing that scientific narrative. It's hard to believe it's false. But I guarantee you, anybody who spends time going through the scientific literature, outcomes literature, what is known about biological causes, you'll end up in the same place I ended up. That's where you'll be. And you'll be like, there's a story in the scientific literature that's completely out of sync with what we're told. So that's changing. Man in America was my first book, and that also told a social history. And there was some sort of positive response in certain circles among psychiatrists to the story of the past. What they didn't like was the story of the present, because in their own history it goes like this. Yeah, things were bad before, but now we're in the promised land. And they didn't like Man in America saying, no, this is not the promised land. That was the first book. Then the second book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, you know what was really written for? Psychiatrists. It really was saying, here's your own evidence base about long-term outcomes, and your own evidence base is saying that, on the whole, you're worsening long-term outcomes with this paradigm of care with one drug for all, one size fits all drug treatment. And here was the response. Initially, it was, that guy's a heretic. And there was really a desire to crush me publicly, to discredit me. But the problem was, then people began looking into the studies, and they found that, that's what our literature is. He's right about a lot of this. And I'm not saying he's going to be right about totally, but they go to the literature and they say, yeah, there is that, there is that, there is that. And now what's happening is I began being asked to do grand rounds. I was asked to speak at the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, which is the think tank for psychiatry. I've been asked to speak to psychiatrist groups in many different countries. And so I published Anatomy of an Epidemic in 2010. There's still plenty of people who say that Whitaker guy's a jerk, don't believe a thing he says, he's anti-psychiatry. So there is that effort to discredit me, but increasingly, actually, that story is being accepted. So the best example of this, the British Journal of Psychiatry this very month, reviewed basically the literature I had reviewed in Anatomy of an Epidemic. They reviewed the same landmark study, so now they're actually following the same trail through their own literature. And you know what they concluded? It looks like maybe these drugs can harm a significant percentage of people diagnosed with schizophrenia. And it could be as many as 40% who should not be taking these drugs. Now that's a totally new story. We haven't been hearing that. So you ask me, what has the response been? It's been denial, I hate that guy, to now people have looked at it and they said there's something here and maybe we should start changing how we use the medications. So this narrative was born in the United States in 1980. This disease model. So we've lived with it longer than you have. And it has fallen apart in the US, okay? So for example, the chemical imbalance narrative. Everybody agrees it didn't happen. Did they really find the biology of the disorders? They say, no, it didn't happen. How about outcomes with the drugs? They're poor. So actually that scientific narrative in the United States is really starting to fall apart. And they're trying to create a new one. But it got exported to India later. So you're at a different point in this cycle. You're still believing in the narrative, and it's still being talked about to your politicians. It's still governing care. It's odd because we invented it, but we exported it later, and it's actually stronger now in other countries. It's stronger in Brazil. It's actually stronger in parts of Europe and India, etc. So how do you counter it? Well, the first thing you do is you just say, okay, science is supposed to be based on scientific findings. Ask them, are they telling you about chemical imbalances in India? Okay, ask them, where's the evidence for that? And say, don't send me to a psychiatric textbook. Show me the science where they found that. And you know what they'll say? well, it's out there. No, you tell me where it is, you're telling the story. And then they'll find that it's not so. So the biggest way you counter a scientific narrative, if it's false, is you go to the scientific literature. And that prompts sort of a existential crisis, because the people who are telling this story, they actually do not know the scientific literature, and then they go to it, and then they're stunned themselves, and it becomes an existential crisis. But that's the way you open up the dialogue. You say, okay, you say this is true, show me. And then you'll find it's not. And then you can start going to the long-term outcomes literature. So for example, on schizophrenia and antipsychotics, in the last 5-6 years alone, we have reports from the United States, report from Netherlands where the off-medicated or low-dose people did better. We have one from Finland. We have a new one from Germany. We have one from Australia. And all that is adding up to where you're getting these editorials in like the British Journal of Psychiatry and elsewhere saying, you know, we have to rethink this. Maybe these drugs worsen long-term outcomes. And for me, an example of this, our head guy is a guy named, or was a head person of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is the biggest funder of research in the world, psychiatric research. The man who heads that is a man named Tom Insel, or he used to. And he recently, or a couple years ago, reviewed some of the literature I had done, and he says, you know, it's time for us to ask ourselves, do these drugs impair long-term functioning? So that's how you counter it. You don't counter it really in the beginning with saying, let's do social care or that sort of thing. You say, let's see if your own narrative holds up, and it doesn't. And that really opens the door to sort of thinking anew. And it is starting to happen in the United States. Fantastic. You know, I've been at a lot of conferences, right? And they're usually inspiring, actually. Because you see brave people, courageous people doing exciting things or trying to improve social justice issues. So I usually find myself energized. This conference has been particularly beautiful and energetic. And it's because we have people from like all over. You have people from, of course, all over Asia, but we have people from Africa, we have people from North America, Europe, really all 5 populated continents. And to see this sort of coming together around a vision of let's do something different, a social justice vision, let's create more just societies, let's look about homeless, giving people housing. It's really inspiring. I mean, I have been energized, and it's just been a real joy to be here. And it's presented a sense of hope. There's a sense of being less isolated. It's been fantastic. And I think really what makes it so special is that you have this people coming from all these different, you have people coming from different cultures, but you know there's a common theme that starts to get sounded from all the different groups. And the reason you see the common theme is that globalization of the disease model has happened. And so we're all sort of like saying, well, what do we do in response? So you see this commonality as well.